Picture this. You're seated at a trestle table so long you can't see the other end through the haze of tallow smoke and roasting meat. The air smells like cinnamon cloves, and something faintly burnt, maybe the swan, maybe your neighbour's beard too close to a candle. On the platter before you sits a bird, but not just any bird. This bird is wearing its own feathers, its neck arched in a lifelike pose, its beak gilded with actual gold leaf. You're supposed to eat it. Well, parts of it. The tongue specifically. Because in medieval Europe, eating wasn't just about survival or even pleasure, it was about sending a message. And that message was, I can afford to waste this. Tonight we're diving into the weirdest, most baffling and occasionally stomach-turning things people ate during the Middle Ages. Not because they had to, not because they were starving, but because fashion, religion, medicine and sheer human stubborn creativity collided in the kitchen and produced meals that would make a modern health inspector weep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment too, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing this strange little community spans time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a guest at a feast. Not a peasant meal of pottage and dark bread, but a real feast, the kind thrown by dukes, bishops, merchants, desperate to look noble. The year doesn't matter much. Pick any century between 1100 and 1500 and you'll find the same theatrical madness. The tables groan under platters of roasted meats, but the meats themselves are almost unrecognisable. Pigs stuffed inside sheep, chickens stitched to piglets, birds reassembled with their plumage so they look alive frozen mid-flight. It's less a meal and more a stage production, where the actors are dead and delicious. Here's the thing about medieval European cuisine, it wasn't designed to taste good in the way we think of flavour today. It was designed to impress, to display wealth, to prove you had access to spices from distant lands, to rare animals, to cooks, skilled enough to pull off culinary taxidermy. The richer you were, the weirder your food got. Peasants ate practical things, cabbage onions, barley, the occasional hen that stopped laying eggs. But nobles ate spectacle. Take the peacock. Peacocks were everywhere in medieval art, symbolising immortality, vanity, and Christ's resurrection, depending on who you asked. Their meat, however, tasted terrible, tough, gamey, stringy. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the presentation. A cook would carefully skin the bird, keeping the feathers intact, then roast the flesh, then sew the feathers back on, arrange the tail in a fan, gild the beak, and present it to the table, as if the bird had simply decided to lie down on the platter fully dressed. Guests would applaud, minstrels might sing about it, and then someone would carve off a bit of dry, chewy meat and pretend it was transcendent. Swans got the same treatment. Roasted, refeathered, sometimes doused in alcohol and set on fire so they arrived at the table literally flaming. Medieval people called these creations subtleties, though there was nothing subtle about a burning swan. The point wasn't sustenance, it was power. It was saying I have so much that I can afford to turn dinner into theatre. But here's where it gets stranger. Some nobles didn't just eat the bird, they ate specific parts of the bird. Tongues, for instance, were prized, not because they tasted better, but because eating 100 tiny tongues, lark tongues, nightingale tongues, peacock tongues was the ultimate flex. It meant you had servants who spent hours extracting slivers of meat from delicate skulls. It meant you could waste 99 birds to serve one dish. Historians still argue whether these tongue feasts were common, or just the fever dreams of chroniclers trying to make their patrons sound impressive, but either way the idea existed, and in medieval Europe the idea was often enough. You sit at that table and someone passes you a dish of something unidentifiable. It's brown, it's glistening, It smells like cinnamon and pepper and maybe regret. You take a bite, it's fine, not great. But everyone around you is nodding solemnly, murmuring appreciations, and you realise this isn't about the food. It never was. This is about being part of the performance. About proving you belong in a world where eating is an art form, a religious act, a political statement, and occasionally a genuine health hazard. And we're just getting started. You're still at that table, candlelight flickering across, faces flushed with wine and self-importance when a servant places a small dish before you. It looks like glazed figs, maybe candied chestnuts. You pick one up. It's warm, sticky with honey, and when you bite down there's a crunch, bones tiny ones, and then the unmistakable texture of meat. Not bird meat, not pork. Something smaller, softer, faintly nutty. You've just eaten a dormouse, and judging by the pleased murmurs around you, you're supposed to feel sophisticated about it. The dormouse specifically, the edible dormouse gliss gliss, a chubby European rodent that looks like a squirrel, designed by someone who had only heard squirrels described second-hand, was a delicacy inherited from the Romans. The Romans were obsessed with them. They built special terracotta jars called dolia, where dormice would be fattened on chestnuts, acorns and walnuts, until they were plump enough to justify the effort. Then they'd be roasted, drizzled with honey, sometimes rolled in poppy seeds, and served as appetizers at banquets. The practice was so common that Roman cookbooks, yes, they had those included multiple dormouse recipes. When Rome fell, a lot of culinary traditions vanished. But not the dormouse. Medieval Europeans, particularly in Italy, France and parts of Germany, kept right on eating them. Not every day, obviously. Dormice weren't livestock. They were seasonal, nocturnal, and required effort to catch. But when autumn came and the dormice fattened themselves, for hibernation trappers would head into the forests with nets and cages. A properly fattened dormouse could weigh as much as a small chicken, and its meat fed on nuts and berries had a delicate, almost sweet flavour. Or so the chroniclers claimed. Modern recreations suggest it tastes like slightly gamey pork with a texture closer to rabbit. Here's the part that makes modern people squeamish. Dormice aren't that different from rats. They're rodents. They have the same basic body plan, long tail, sharp teeth, twitchy noses. But medieval diners didn't see them that way. Rats were urban pests, carriers of disease, dwellers of filth. Dormice were forest creatures, nut-eaters clean. The distinction mattered. It was the same logic that let people eat rabbits and hares without flinching while recoiling from their cousin the rat. Environment and diet determined edibility, not taxonomy. You finish your honeyed dormouse licking your fingers because there's no shame in that here everyone's doing it. And you wonder how many creatures met this fate. How many dormice were plucked from their tree hollows, their cosy nests lined with moss and stolen feathers, and dropped into boiling water or skewered over coals. The answer is thousands, tens of thousands. In some regions, dormouse hunting was a legitimate autumn industry. Families would smoke them, salt them, store them in oil for winter. They were protein. They were luxury. They were proof that if something could be caught and cooked, it would be. But dormice weren't the only rodents on the menu. Squirrels read one specifically. Since grey squirrels hadn't yet invaded Europe from North America, were fair game too. Squirrel pie was a real thing. You'd skin the squirrel, joint it like a tiny chicken stew. It with onions, herbs, and whatever wine was too sour to drink straight. The result was supposedly tender and flavourful, though you had to be careful of the small bones. Cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries mention squirrel casually, right alongside recipes for venison and pork, as if it's the most natural thing in the world to eat something you watched scramble up an oak tree that morning. Historians still argue whether these rodent dishes were everyday fare or special occasion foods. The evidence suggests both, depending on class and region. A peasant wouldn't waste time trapping dormice when there were fish in the stream and chickens in the yard. But a wealthy merchant trying to impress dinner guests with his knowledge of classical cuisine? Absolutely. Dormice were cultured. They had literary pedigree. Serving them meant you'd read, or at least heard of, Roman texts. You were connecting your table to the tables of emperors, even if your empire was just a profitable wool trade and a nice house in Bruges. And here's the uncomfortable truth: they probably tasted fine, maybe even good. Honey masks a multitude of sins, and if you've been raised in a world where meat means anything that once had a heartbeat and isn't actively poisonous, your palate adjusts. You don't think rodent, you think roasted thing with sweet glaze. Your brain doesn't revolt because your culture hasn't told it to. The weirdness is ours, not theirs. You glance around the table. Someone's gnawing on a bird wing, someone else is spooning up a stew that smells of saffron and looks suspicious. The conversation flows trade routes, marriages, the price of Flemish cloth. No one's talking about the food anymore. It's just their fuel and theatre combined, and you're part of it now. You've eaten the dormouse. You've crossed a threshold you didn't know existed until you looked back from the other side. The platters keep coming. The servant leans over your shoulder again, and this time the dish is different. Darker. The smell hits you first. Rich, almost metallic, with a sharpness that cuts through the smoky air. It's a pie, but not the kind you'd recognise. The crust is thick golden, built more like a casket than a pastry. Inside, coiled in its own jelly, is something that looks like a snake but isn't quite. The skin is mottled grey-brown slick. The flesh beneath is pale and fatty. Someone across the table says the word with reverence: lamprey. You've heard of lampreys, maybe. In your time, they're the stuff of nature documentaries, those nightmare fish, with circular mouths full of concentric rows of teeth, latching onto salmon and sucking their blood like aquatic vampires. In medieval Europe, they were royalty. Literally. Kings demanded them. Nobles paid extravagant prices for them. And at least one monarch, King Henry III of England, possibly died from eating too many. Let's talk about that death, because it's the kind of historical footnote that historians love to argue about. The year is 1135. Henry's in Normandy, aging and robust for his time, but pushing 60. He eats a meal of lampreys against his physician's advice. A few days later, he's dead. The chroniclers blame the lampreys. Modern historians are sceptical: food poisoning, sure, but lampreys specifically, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it was the sheer quantity. Maybe the fish were poorly prepared, their rich flesh going rancid in the autumn heat. Or maybe Henry's body just couldn't handle the richness anymore, the thick oils and dense proteins of a creature that spends its life filtering through river mud. But here's the thing: even knowing lampreys might kill you didn't stop people from eating them. If anything, it made them more desirable. Danger was part of the appeal. Lampreys were expensive, hard to catch, seasonal. They migrated up rivers in spring and fall, and fishermen would trap them in weirs wooden fences built across the current. The lampreys would swim into the maze and couldn't find their way out. Some rivers, like the Severn in England, were famous for their lamprey runs. Towns built their economies around them. Gloucester sent lamprey pies to the English crown every Christmas, as a form of tax, a tradition that continued for centuries. You lift a piece of the lamprey from the pie. The flesh is dense, almost meaty, more like pork than fish. The texture is strange, slippery on the outside, firm within. There's a sweetness to the jelly, which you'll learn later is made from the lamprey's own gelatin, mixed with wine and spices, cinnamon, cloves, maybe some ginger. The spices are doing heavy lifting here, masking the muddy undertone that all bottom feeders carry, the taste of river silt and cold stone. Medieval people didn't classify lampreys as fish in the way we do now. They were somewhere between fish and eel, categorized more by their environment than their biology. They lived in water, therefore they were fish for religious purposes, which meant you could eat them on Fridays and during Lent when meat was forbidden. This loophole was enormously important. The church controlled the calendar, and the calendar controlled your stomach. For roughly half the year, you weren't supposed to eat anything that came from a warm-blooded animal. No beef, no pork, no chicken. But fish were fine, and lampreys, despite being vertebrates with something resembling a spine, counted. So lamprey became a luxury food tied to piety. You could eat like a king while technically fasting. The rich would serve them at Friday feasts, their tables groaning with fish that cost more than most people earned in a month. A single lamprey could buy you a week's worth of bread. A lamprey pie could buy you a favour from a local lord. They were currency, status and sustenance wrapped in pastry. But let's be honest, they were also kind of horrifying. Even medieval diners who had strong stomachs by necessity found lampreys unsettling. Cookbook instructions often mention removing the head because the mouth that ringed alien mouth disturbed people. The circular rows of teeth, the way the jaw seemed to gape even in death, the faint resemblance to something that should be crawling through nightmares rather than swimming through rivers. Cooks learned to disguise them, to coil them so they looked less like themselves, to bury them in spices and wine until the lampreyness was just a suggestion. You take another bite, it's fine. Richer than you expected, oily enough to coat your tongue. You can see why someone might overindulge, why Henry might have eaten plate after plate, ignoring his physician, ignoring the tightness in his gut, because when you're a king, you don't stop eating something delicious just because it might kill you. That's what physicians are for, to warn you to fret to be ignored. Around the table, others are eating their lamprey with quiet focus. No one talks about the fish itself, the strangeness of it, because it's not strange to them. It's just November. It's just Friday. It's just what you eat when you're wealthy enough to afford the river's ugliest treasure. The pie dish empties, the next course approaches, the next platter arrives, and you're starting to notice a pattern. Every time you think you've seen the strangest thing this kitchen can produce, something new appears that makes you reconsider what counts as food. This time it's a bird, small, dark, feathered, roasted whole. Its beak is intact, slightly hooked. Its wings are crisped. Someone murmurs puffin like it's an explanation, and you nod because what else are you going to do? Question the taxonomy of your dinner in front of nobles who've been eating this since childhood. Puffins. Those rotund seabirds with the clown-coloured beaks, the ones that nest in burrows on coastal cliffs and look like they were designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. In your time, they're protected, photographed, beloved. In medieval Europe, they were Friday food, Lenten food, fish. Yes, fish. Here's where the weirdness gets institutional. The Catholic Church, which governed not just souls but stomachs, had strict rules about fasting. Meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden on Fridays during Lent. On certain saints' days altogether, you were looking at roughly 150 meatless days per year. But fish was allowed. Anything that lived primarily in or around water could be classified as fish, and therefore consumed without sin. And this is where medieval logic gets beautifully, bizarrely creative. Puffins live on cliffs, sure, but they spend most of their time at sea diving for fish bobbing on waves. They taste like fish, or at least they taste strongly of the fish they eat. Their flesh is dark, oily, redolent of salt and ocean. So some clever cleric somewhere, and historians still argue about exactly when and where this reasoning solidified, decided puffins are fish, not birds, fish. It wasn't just puffins. Barnacle geese got the same treatment. There was a medieval belief widespread and genuinely held by educated people that barnacle geese didn't hatch from eggs like normal birds. Instead, they grew from barnacles attached to driftwood emerging fully formed from the sea. This made them sea creatures, which made them fish, which made them acceptable to eat on Fridays. The logic was airtight if you ignored biology entirely, which medieval Europeans were perfectly happy to do when dinner was at stake. You pick at the puffin on your plate. The meat is indeed dark, almost liver-like in colour. It's rich, gamey with a marine funk that no amount of herb stuffing can fully disguise. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's strong. You understand immediately why this needed church approval to catch on. Without the religious loophole, no one would choose to eat this over chicken. But with the loophole, suddenly puffin isn't just permissible, it's desirable. It's piety you can taste. Coastal communities in Ireland, Scotland, Iceland and Norway built traditions around seabird hunting. Men would rappel down cliffs on ropes harvesting puffins, guillemots, razorbills from their nests. It was dangerous work, one slip and you're tumbling onto rocks or into frigid water. But the birds were plentiful, and during Lent protein was protein. Families would salt them, smoke them, store them in barrels. A household's winter survival could depend on a good seabird harvest. The church's classification system created an entire economy. If puffins were meat, they'd be worthless 6 months of the year. But as fish, they had a value year-round. Monasteries near coastlines developed thriving trades in salted seabirds. They'd pack them in barrels and ship them inland to communities that never saw the ocean, where puffin became an exotic Lenten delicacy, proof that even in your fasting you could access the wider world. Historians still argue whether church authorities truly believed this classification, or whether it was a pragmatic accommodation. Did bishops genuinely think puffins were fish? Or did they just recognise that telling fishermen they couldn't eat the one abundant protein source during Lent was a recipe for rebellion? Probably both. Medieval theology was flexible when it needed to be rigid when it suited authority. The puffin loophole let everyone face the church maintained its fasting rules, and coastal communities maintained their diets. You glance around the table. Others are eating their puffins, methodically deboning them with practiced fingers. No one seems troubled by the reasoning. Of course, puffins are fish. They taste like the sea. They smell like the sea. What else would they be? To question it would be to question the structure that allows this feast to exist at all, a careful dance between religious law and human appetite. And honestly, after the dormouse and the lamprey, a puffin seems almost reasonable. At least it's recognisable. At least you know what animal you're eating, even if the category it's been shoved into makes no scientific sense. Medieval cuisine wasn't about science. It was about survival status and the peculiar mental gymnastics required to eat well while appearing devout. The puffin's tiny bones crunch between your teeth. You taste salt iron, the ghost of fish oils. Someone passes you bread to cut the richness, and you take it gratefully. The meal continues. The candles burn lower. Outside the real ocean rolls dark and cold, full of birds that don't know they've been reclassified, that their existence has been bent to fit human hunger and divine decree. You swallow. The puffin becomes part of you. Somewhere a monk is writing this down as acceptable, as holy even. The next course is already coming. The servant appears again. Honestly, these people are relentless, and this time the platter holds something that makes the puffin look downright conventional. It's flat paddle-shaped, covered in dark, glistening skin that's been scored and roasted until it looks like leather left too long in the sun. Someone near you murmurs appreciatively, "Beaver tail, Friday's finest." You blink. Beaver. The dam-building, tree-gnawing, flat-tailed rodent that lives in rivers and ponds. That beaver. And you're about to eat its tail. Not as some desperate survival measure, not because the harvest failed and people are starving, but because it's Friday and the church says you can. Here's where the medieval classification system gets truly creative. Beavers are mammals, warm-blooded, fur-bearing, unquestionably not fish, but their tails are different. Beaver tails are scaly, flat, fin-like. They're used for swimming. They spend most of their time underwater, and most importantly, they look nothing like the rest of the beaver. So medieval theologians, faced with the question of whether beaver could be eaten during Lent, split the animal in half. The body was meat forbidden, the tail was fish permitted. This wasn't some fringe belief held by one eccentric monastery. This was official church teaching debated by scholars, endorsed by bishops. The logic went like this: animals are defined by their primary element. Creatures of the air, birds, are meat. Creatures of the earth, cattle, pigs, are meat. But creatures of the water are fish, regardless of whether they breathe air or have fur. A beaver's body might walk on land, but its tail belongs to the water. Therefore the tail is fish. The theological acrobatics required to reach this conclusion were impressive, but the motivation was straightforward. Beaver tails were delicious, and people didn't want to give them up for Lent, especially in North America, where French Catholic colonists and missionaries would later adopt this same reasoning. Beaver tail became a Lenten staple. But even in medieval Europe, where beavers were less common but still present in rivers across France, Germany and Eastern Europe, the tail was prized. You cut into the tail on your plate. The flesh beneath the skin is pale, fatty, rich. It's been roasted with herbs, rosemary, maybe thyme, and there's a sweetness to it, almost like pork, but with a cleaner finish. The texture is gelatinous, dense, more like tongue than fish. The fat coats your mouth, immediately slick and satisfying. You understand the appeal. This isn't survival food. This is good. Beaver wasn't easy to get. The animals were shy nocturnal, and their numbers were already declining in parts of Europe due to overhunting, not just for their tails, but for their pelts and castoreum, a secretion used in medicine and perfume. A beaver tail at your table meant someone had access to trappers, to wild rivers, to the supply chains that moved luxury goods from forest to kitchen. It was a statement: even in fasting I eat well. The classification extended beyond just beavers. Any aquatic mammal became suspect, subject to theological review. Seals were debated. Some argued their flippers made them fish adjacent. Others pointed out they nursed their young on land, which seemed distinctly mammalian. The church's position shifted depending on region and necessity. In coastal areas where seal meat was abundant, you'd find more lenient interpretations. Inland, where seals were exotic, the debate was more academic. Historians still argue whether these classifications were sincere theological positions or cynical workarounds. Did church authorities genuinely believe a beaver tail was fundamentally different from beaver flesh? Or were they accommodating powerful patrons who wanted their Friday meals to remain interesting? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Medieval people were capable of genuine belief in categories that seem absurd to us, but they were also pragmatic. Faith and appetite weren't separate spheres, they were constantly negotiating. You take another bite of the beaver tail, the fat pools on the plate catching candlelight. Around you, other diners are eating theirs with the same focused pleasure they gave the lamprey, the puffin. No one's discussing the theology. That battle was fought and won generations ago. Now it's just tradition. Just another Friday. Just another animal split into edible and forbidden parts by human convenience and divine interpretation. And here's the uncomfortable part: it works. The mental gymnastics become invisible when you're raised with them. You don't think I'm eating a mammal's tail and calling it fish. You think I'm observing Lent properly while still eating well. The cognitive dissonance never arises because the culture has smoothed it away, packaged it in rosemary and ritual until it feels natural. The serving dish makes its way down the table. Someone takes seconds. Why wouldn't they? It's rich. It's rare. It's religiously sanctioned. It's everything medieval cuisine aspired to be: practical theology, made edible desire, dressed up as devotion. You wipe the grease from your fingers onto your bread. The beaver tail sits heavy in your stomach, dense and satisfying. Outside, real beavers are building real dams, unaware that their bodies have been divided by human decree into permitted and forbidden zones, that their tails have been drafted into service as honorary fish. The next platter is already visible in the servant's hands. This meal shows no signs of ending. Neither does the strangeness. You're beginning to feel the weight of the meal, not just physically, though, there's that too, a fullness building in your gut, but mentally. Each course requires recalibration. Each plate demands you accept something new about what counts as food, as appropriate as normal. And then the next dish arrives, and it's a porpoise. Not a whole porpoise, thankfully. That would require a table the size of a ship's deck. But a significant section dark flesh, dense and meaty, served in thick slices with a wine-based sauce that can't quite mask the marine intensity beneath. The smell is immediate ocean salt, something almost metallic. Around you, nobles are nodding approval. This is luxury. This is Friday done right. Porpoises, dolphins and their larger cousins, the small whales, the pilot whales, the occasional orca, if you were extremely lucky or unlucky depending on your perspective, were all considered fish by medieval standards. They lived in water, they swam, therefore fish. The fact that they breathed air, nursed their young and had warm blood was inconvenient detail that theology simply chose to overlook. What mattered was habitat and availability, and in coastal regions these creatures represented protein on a grand scale. When a porpoise or dolphin beached itself, which happened with some regularity, it was an event. Entire villages would turn out to butcher the animal, dividing the meat according to complex hierarchies. The Lord got the best cuts. The church got a portion for the poor. Fishermen who found the creature got a share. What remained would be salted, smoked, distributed. A single dolphin could feed a community for weeks. But this isn't scavenged meat from a beach. This is deliberate, hunted, expensive. You can tell by the way it's presented, carefully carved, sauced, garnished. This porpoise was killed on purpose, probably driven into shallow water by boats then speared or netted. It was a coordinated effort, dangerous work in cold water, and the meat's presence here means someone paid significantly for it. You cut a piece. The flesh is darker than beef, closer to venison in colour, but denser in texture. It's rich, intensely rich with a flavour that's hard to place. Not fishy exactly, though there's an ocean note underneath. More like a water-dwelling version of red meat, if that makes any sense. The fat content is high, and you can feel it coating your tongue, thick and substantial. Medieval diners would have considered this a virtue. Fat was fuel. Fat was survival. Fat was expensive. The sauce helps. It's acidic, probably verjuice or wine vinegar cutting through the richness with herbs you can't quite identify. Sage, maybe. Something sharper. The combination makes the porpoise palatable, even pleasant, though you suspect eating it plain would be overwhelming. Dolphins and porpoises weren't just food, they were status symbols. A dolphin on your table meant you had coastal connections, access to fishing communities, the wealth to transport perishable meat inland before it spoiled. In an age before refrigeration, getting dolphin from the sea to a nobleman's table 50 miles away was a logistical achievement. The meat would be packed in barrels with salt or transported live in seawater if the journey was short enough. Either way, it was expensive, complicated, and therefore desirable. Historians still argue about how common this practice was. Written records mention dolphin and porpoise frequently in the menus of wealthy households, but written records are biased toward the wealthy. Peasants weren't writing down their meals, so we know nobles ate dolphin, but we don't know how often. Was it a weekly occurrence in coastal castles, or a rare treat reserved for important feasts? Probably somewhere in between, depending on the season, the weather, the pod's migration patterns. The medieval mind didn't see these animals the way we do. There was no concept of marine mammal conservation, no understanding of dolphin intelligence or complex social structures. They were food that happened to swim. They were God's creatures, yes, but God had created them for human use. The Bible said so, dominion over the fish of the sea. And if dolphins counted as fish, which they did officially, then eating them was not just permitted but practically mandated. You take another bite. The richness is building now, accumulating. You reach for wine-watered spice to cut through the fat. Around you, the conversation has shifted to trade routes, to ships, to the price of wool. No one's discussing the porpoise. It's just there being consumed, fulfilling its purpose. And here's the thing, the porpoise doesn't taste bad. If you didn't know what it was, if someone told you it was a particularly rich cut of venison from a water-dwelling deer, you'd probably accept that. Your modern horror at eating dolphin is cultural, not gustatory. The meat itself is fine. It's your context that makes it weird. Medieval diners had different contexts. They saw the ocean as a larder stocked by divine providence with swimming meat. They saw dolphins leaping beside their boats and thought protein. They heard stories about dolphins saving drowning sailors and still ate them without cognitive dissonance because gratitude and appetite occupied different mental spaces. The platter empties. The servants clear it away. You notice some diners took multiple servings, piling their plates while the porpoise was available. No one knows when it'll appear again. Opportunity must be seized. Meat is meat, especially meat that counts as fish, especially on a Friday when the calendar demands sacrifice, but your stomach demands substance. Outside, somewhere in cold waters, a pod of porpoises is navigating by echolocation, communicating in clicks and whistles, living their complex social lives. Inside, their cousin is being digested, transformed into energy for nobles, who'll never swim those waters, who'll never know what it's like to exist between air and ocean, who've never had to hold their breath. The next course is coming. The meal continues. The table is starting to look like a battlefield. Bones pile up grease pools on wooden trenches. Bread has been reduced to wine-soaked fragments serving as edible napkins. You think, surely this must be the end, surely there can't be more. But then you hear a commotion from the kitchen doorway. Musicians start playing, actual musicians, not background ambience, but a ceremonial fanfare. Everyone at the table straightens, turns to look. The servants process in, carrying something enormous on a platter, so large it requires 4 men. As they get closer, you see it a swan, but not a roasted naked swan. A dressed swan, fully refeathered wings spread as if caught mid-flight, neck curved in its natural S shape, every white plume pristine and positioned. The bird looks alive, except for the fact that it's clearly roasted underneath all that plumage, and also it's been gilded. Gold leaf on the beak, gold on the feet. This isn't food, it's a sculpture that you're somehow expected to eat. Welcome to the pinnacle of medieval culinary theatre, the roasted bird redressed in its own feathers. This wasn't unusual. This was expected at any feast worth attending. Swans, peacocks, herons, any bird impressive enough to make guests gasp required this treatment. The process was elaborate, time-consuming, and slightly insane by modern standards. Here's how it worked. First, the cook would carefully skin the bird, keeping the feathers attached to the skin, in one complete piece, like removing a feathered coat. The naked bird underneath would be roasted with spices and stuffing. Meanwhile, the skin would be preserved, sometimes stretched over a wooden frame to maintain its shape. Once the meat was cooked, the cook would sew the feathered skin back onto the body, positioning it so the bird appeared lifelike. Wings would be wired to spread. The neck would be propped with sticks. The beak would be gilded. Sometimes they'd even put the bird's feet back on curved, as if gripping an invisible branch. The result was unsettling. Beautiful, yes, but also deeply strange. A culinary taxidermy that made you question what you were looking at. A living bird. A dead bird. Some uncanny thing in between. The swan makes its way around the table. A carver, not a regular servant, but a professional. Someone trained specifically in this theatrical butchery begins slicing. He works carefully, peeling back the feathered skin section by section, revealing the roasted meat beneath. The skin itself isn't eaten. It's just decoration, a costume for the corpse. The meat underneath is what matters though, honestly. After all the skinning and refeathering and propping, it's probably cold and dry. You receive your portion, a slice of breast meat, grey-white and stringy. Swan doesn't taste great. It's tough gamey, required significant chewing. But that's not the point. The point is that a swan died for this moment. The point is the labour involved the hours of careful skinning, roasting, reassembly. The point is that everyone at this table witnessed the swan's arrival, the ceremonial presentation, and now shares in the consumption of something that required an entire team of skilled workers to prepare. Peacocks got the same treatment, maybe even more elaborately. Because while swans were impressive, peacocks had those tail feathers, iridescent eye-spotted, massive. A properly dressed peacock could span the length of the table, its tail displayed in full fan, each feather catching candlelight. Cooks would sometimes go a step further and stuff the bird with aromatic herbs, cinnamon bark, cloves, whole nutmegs, so that when carved it released a cloud of scented steam. The meal became a multi-sensory experience, visual spectacle, aromatic theatre, and somewhere in there actual food. Historians still argue whether anyone actually enjoyed eating these birds or whether it was purely performative. Swan and peacock meat was notoriously tough and bland. Even medieval cookbooks, which rarely criticised ingredients, offer recipes designed to make swan palatable. Long stewing times, heavy sauces, lots of spices. The subtext is clear, this meat needs help, but enjoyment wasn't the goal. Impression was. These birds weren't livestock you could raise on a farm. Swans were royal birds protected by law in England. Killing one without permission could result in fines or worse. Peacocks were exotic, expensive to maintain. Serving them meant you had access, connections, wealth. It meant you could afford to waste hours of skilled labour on presentation alone. You chew your swan. It's not good. Around you, others are chewing too, everyone making the same polite show of enjoyment. The musicians are still playing. The carver is still working, peeling back more feathered skin, revealing more grey meat. The swan in pieces now no longer looks like a bird. Just looks like dinner, disappointing dinner, but dinner nonetheless. And here's the absurdity: while you're forcing down dry swan meat, you're surrounded by actually delicious food. The pies, the stews, the roasted pork from earlier courses, all of it tasted better than this. But none of it will be remembered like the swan. None of it will be written about in letters mentioned in chronicles, become part of the feast legend. The swan is the story. The swan is what people will talk about tomorrow, next week, next year. Remember that feast where they served a gilded swan. The performance justifies itself. The meal isn't just about sustenance, it's about creating a shared memory, a collective experience of witnessing something excessive and strange and slightly wonderful. You might forget the taste of the swan, but you won't forget how it looked arriving at the table wing spread impossibly alive, looking absurdly dead. The platter moves on. The swan is dismantled. Somewhere in the kitchen, the feathered skin is being discarded or possibly saved for another feast. Another bird, another performance. The cycle continues. The swan's decimated carcass is finally carried away, and you're hoping for something simpler, something that doesn't require emotional preparation or taxonomic justification. Instead, what arrives is a pie. But the crust is moving. Not dramatically, just small subtle shifts, tiny cracks appearing in the golden pastry. Then you realise there are quills poking through. Small ones brown and stiff. Someone near you chuckles and says, "Hedgehog. Haven't had this in months." Hedgehog. The small, spiny, nocturnal creature that rolls into a ball when threatened and lives in hedgerows eating slugs and beetles. That hedgehog, baked into a pie. And apparently people have been waiting for it. Here's the thing about medieval protein sources: if it moved and wasn't explicitly poisonous, someone was eating it. Hedgehogs were woodland creatures, plentiful across Europe, easy to catch if you knew where to look. They were slow, predictable, and when threatened they didn't run. They curled up, presenting their spines, which made them even easier to collect. Peasants would gather them in autumn when the hedgehogs were fattest, preparing for hibernation. Preparing a hedgehog required technique. You couldn't just toss it in a pot, the spines were a problem. Some cooks would encase the whole animal in clay, bake it, then crack off the clay shell, which would take the spines with it. Others would gut and skin the creature first, working carefully around the quills. The result was a small portion of dark gamey meat that supposedly tasted like a cross between pork and rabbit, with a slightly earthy undertone from the hedgehog's diet of insects and roots. The pie before you has been properly prepared, no spines inside, just meat, mixed with onions, herbs, maybe some small birds for bulk. But a few quills have been stuck into the crust afterward, a whimsical touch, a reminder of what you're eating. Because medieval cooks had a sense of humour about these things. If you're going to eat a hedgehog, why not announce it? You take a portion. The meat is dark, finely shredded, mixed into a thick gravy that tastes heavily of sage and pepper. It's fine. Not remarkable, but not unpleasant. Richer than chicken, less assertive than venison. You can see why it appealed to people with limited options. A hedgehog could feed a small family, required no farming or husbandry, just knowledge of where they nested and the willingness to deal with the spines. But hedgehogs weren't the only small woodland creatures on the menu. Squirrels were even more common. Red squirrels, specifically the grey ones, wouldn't invade from America until centuries later. Squirrel pie was a real staple in some regions, particularly in forested areas where squirrels were abundant. They'd be skinned, jointed like tiny rabbits, stewed with root vegetables and whatever herbs were available. Cookbooks from the period mention squirrel casually as if it's as normal as chicken. And maybe it was. Maybe the strangeness is ours, not theirs. We've been trained to see squirrels as park decorations, cute things that bury nuts and scold from trees. Medieval people saw them as meat that lived in trees. The cuteness didn't register. The bushy tail wasn't charming. It was just a part you removed before cooking, like feathers from a bird. The same logic applied to dormice, remember those from earlier, and to rabbits' hairs, any small mammal that could be trapped or snared. The distinction between pest and food was purely practical. Did it damage your crops, pest? Did it live in the forest and taste decent when roasted food? Urban rats were pests because they ate your grain stores and lived in filth. Forest dormice were food because they ate nuts and lived in clean nests. Historians still argue about how common these dishes were among different classes. Clearly peasants ate hedgehog and squirrel more regularly than nobles, but nobles weren't above it, especially during winter when fresh meat was scarce, and preserved pork was getting monotonous. A hedgehog pie added variety, and more importantly, it added a story. We had hedgehog last night was more interesting than we had pork again. You finish your portion of the pie. Around you, others are picking out the bits of meat, leaving the pastry crust behind. It's trencher bread meant to soak up grease and be discarded or given to servants later. The hedgehog has been consumed, transformed from spiny woodland creature to fuel to story to memory. And here's what strikes you the casualness of it all. No one at this table is treating hedgehog pie as exotic or strange. It's just another course in a long meal. The spectacle was saved for the swan, the lamprey, the peacock. The hedgehog is workday food dressed up for company, and that makes it more honest somehow. This is what people actually ate, not what they performed eating. Somewhere outside in the hedgerows and forest edges, real hedgehogs are shuffling through leaf litter, hunting beetles oblivious to their culinary destiny. Some will make it through winter. Some won't. Some will end up in pies at tables like this one. Their small bodies providing sustenance to people who see the world not as a nature documentary, but as a larder, a testing ground, a place where everything is either useful or irrelevant. The servants clear the hedgehog pie. Someone mentions that squirrel will be available soon, the spring hunt is coming. Others nod interested. The conversation moves on. The meal moves on. You're not even surprised anymore. That's the strangest part. You've eaten dormouse, lamprey, puffin, beaver tail, porpoise, swan and hedgehog, and you're still sitting here, still chewing, still accepting whatever comes next. Medieval feasting isn't just about food. It's about the gradual erosion of your assumptions, one bizarre course at a time. The next platter is approaching. You don't even ask what it is anymore. The next dish arrives with less ceremony, a blessing honestly, and at first glance it looks almost normal. Dark meat in chunks swimming in a thin broth served in wooden bowls. Then someone says whale, like it's no more remarkable than mutton, and you have to recalibrate again. Whale. One of the largest creatures to ever exist, reduced to stew meat, ladled into bowls for Friday dinner. Whale wasn't rare in medieval coastal communities. It wasn't even particularly special. When a whale beached, and they did regularly driven by disease or disorientation onto shores from Norway to Brittany, it was a windfall. Literally tons of meat all at once appearing like divine providence on your doorstep. The law was clear. In most places, beached whales belonged to the crown or the local lord. But the actual butchering, the processing, the distribution that required the whole community. And communities took their share, officially or otherwise. The meat before you is dense, dark red, almost purple in the candlelight. It's been salted, you can taste that immediately, which means it's not from a fresh beaching, but from stores, from barrels packed months ago when some whale made the mistake of swimming too close to shore. The salt helps covering the intense marine flavour that fresh whale carries, that taste of deep ocean and ancient cold. You chew. The texture is closer to beef than fish, fibrous and substantial. It's not tender whale meat, rarely is, but it's filling in a way that fish isn't. This is red meat pretending to be fish for Lenten purposes, and everyone at the table accepts this fiction because the alternative is going hungry or breaking religious law, and neither option appeals. Coastal villages developed entire economies around whaling, though whaling is perhaps too grand a term for what they did. They didn't go hunting whales with harpoons and boats. That technology existed but was rare and dangerous. Mostly they waited. They watched the coastline. When a whale appeared in shallow water, struggling sick loss, they helped it die faster. Drove it further onto the beach. Killed it with whatever they had, spears, axes, knives. It wasn't noble. It wasn't sporting. It was practical butchery on an enormous scale. A single whale could feed a village for months. The meat would be cut into manageable chunks, salted, packed in barrels. The blubber would be rendered for oil lamp oil, cooking oil for preserving leather. The bones would be carved into tools, supports for roofs, ribs for boat construction. Nothing was wasted, because wasting a whale wasn't just impractical, it was almost sacrilegious. When God delivers 10 tons of protein to your beach, you use every bit. Different whale species had different values. Smaller whales, pilot whales, orcas, if you were very fortunate or unfortunate depending on perspective, were more common. Their meat was darker, stronger flavoured but still usable. Larger baleen whales were rarer but provided more meat. The quality varied depending on the whale's health when it died, how long it had been dead. Before butchering began, how quickly the meat could be preserved. Historians still argue about whether medieval people distinguish between whale species or just lump them all together as large sea creatures. Written records mention whale without specifics, which suggests the distinction didn't matter much to most people. Meat was meat. If it came from something that swam and was too big to fit in a cooking pot hole, it was whale. The church's position on whale was predictably convenient fish. Obviously fish. It lived in water, therefore fish. The fact that whales breathed air, gave live birth and nursed their young with milk. All these details were inconvenient and therefore ignored. Aquatic habitat trumped biological reality. This meant whale meat could be eaten year-round without sin making it valuable not just as nutrition but as a religious commodity. Some monasteries near coastlines included rights to beached whales in their charters, legal documents guaranteeing them a share of any cetacean that washed ashore. This wasn't symbolic, it was economically important. A monastery with whale rights could feed itself, and its dependents through winter could trade surplus meat for grain, or wine could maintain its charitable obligations to the poor. Whale meat showed up in records of almsgiving distributed to the needy during Lent, proof of the church's provision. You finish your bowl of whale stew. It sits heavy in your stomach, denser than anything else you've eaten tonight. Around the table, others are sopping up the broth with bread, extracting every bit of nutrition. No one's waxing poetic about the taste, it's sustenance, not art. The whale serves its purpose, filling bellies on a day when meat is forbidden, providing protein that counts as fish, because theology says so. And here's the grim reality. Medieval people didn't think about whale conservation. They didn't consider whether their beachside butchering was sustainable or ethical. They saw a resource and used it. The ocean seemed infinite. Whales seemed abundant. The idea that human activity could threaten whale populations wouldn't emerge for centuries, and even then it would take decades more before anyone cared enough to act. So they ate whale, salted it, stewed it, traded it, rendered its blubber and carved its bones, treated it as a gift from God delivered by tide and providence, a solution to the eternal problem of winter hunger and religious dietary restrictions. Outside in waters too deep and cold to imagine, real whales are migrating, singing their long, complex songs, living their slow, mysterious lives. Inside, their flesh is being digested, absorbed, becoming part of people who will never know what it's like to dive that deep, to hold their breath that long, to navigate by sound through darkness. The bowls are cleared, the whale is consumed, the meal continues because of course it does. You're expecting another exotic protein, another creature pulled from an unlikely habitat and reclassified for theological convenience. Instead, what arrives looks like exactly what it is, a plate of organ meats. Liver, kidneys, heart, stomach, lining all of it, glistening in butter and blood, cooked just enough to be safe, but not enough to be tender. The smell is iron-rich, almost overwhelming. Someone across the table actually looks pleased. Finally, they mutter, the good parts. This might be the most honest course you've had all night. No feathers sewn back on, no theological loopholes. Just organs, the parts. Modern squeamishness has taught you to avoid presented as if they're the main event. Because in medieval Europe they were. Here's what we've forgotten: when you kill an animal, especially a large one like a pig or cow, the organ meat spoils faster than muscle meat. You can salt and smoke a ham for months, but liver, heart, kidneys, those need to be eaten quickly within a day or two or they'll rot. So they weren't leftovers, they weren't scraps for the poor. They were the first thing consumed, the premium cuts that required immediate attention. Medieval butchers knew this. Families knew this. When the autumn pig was slaughtered, the organs became that night's feast. The blood would be collected for pudding, we'll get to that, and the liver, heart, kidneys and tongue would be roasted or fried and eaten while they were fresh. The bacon and hams could wait. The organs couldn't. You cut into what appears to be kidney. It's dense, almost spongy, with a mineral taste that's not unpleasant but definitely present. Strong. Assertive. The kind of flavour that doesn't hide behind spices, though someone has tried with butter and herbs. The kidney tastes like kidney, earthy, slightly bitter, intensely meaty in a way that muscle tissue never is. Next to it, a slice of liver. This is more familiar, at least conceptually, though. This liver is darker than any you've seen, probably from a game animal, deer or boar. It's been cooked rare pink in the middle, and when you cut it, blood seeps onto the plate. Medieval cooks believed overcooking liver made it tough and dry, which is true, but they also believed rare meat retained more of its vital essences, which is medieval medicine talking humoral theory insisting that like increases like. Eat bloody liver to strengthen your blood. The heart is there too, sliced thin, chewy and fibrous. Heart is all muscle, the hardest working muscle in any body, and it tastes like it dense and tireless, even in death. It's been marinated in something acidic, probably vinegar, to break down the toughness. It helps, but you still need to chew, and chew. Your jaw works, and you think about the fact that you're eating the engine that kept another creature alive, the pump that circulated its blood through its body, until someone decided its body was more useful as food than as a living thing. Organ meat wasn't just practical, it was considered medicinal. Medieval physicians working from Galenic theory that dominated medical thought for centuries believed that eating an animal's organs strengthened the corresponding organ in your own body. Weak lungs, eat lungs. Poor digestion, eat stomach. Tired heart. You know what to do. It was sympathetic magic dressed up as medicine, but it influenced what people ate and how they thought about food. This meant organs weren't just tolerated, they were sought after. A lord recovering from illness might specifically request liver. A woman after childbirth might be given blood pudding to restore her strength. Athletes and soldiers would eat heart before competitions or battles. The organs carried power, or at least the belief in power, which might amount to the same thing, in terms of actual recovery through placebo effect and nutritional benefit. Blood deserves special mention here. Medieval people didn't waste blood. When an animal was slaughtered, the blood was caught in buckets, whisked to prevent clotting, and immediately used. Blood pudding, black pudding, blood sausage, boudin, noix, morcilla. Names varying by region, but concept identical, was made by mixing fresh blood with fat grain onions and spices, then stuffing it into intestines and boiling or frying. The result was dark, rich, iron-heavy and shelf-stable enough to last weeks. Some regions had blood soups, blood pancakes, blood bread. Nothing was squeamish. Blood was protein iron binding agent too useful to pour onto the ground and waste, and unlike muscle meat which spoiled or organs which spoiled faster, blood could be processed into something durable. A family that slaughtered a pig in November could be eating blood pudding in February. You work your way through the organ plate. There's tongue too, not the prestigious peacock tongue from earlier, but regular pig or cow tongue boiled until tender sliced thin. It's mild compared to the other organs, almost sweet, the texture somewhere between roast beef and something softer. Tongue was practical. It kept better than liver could be salted, didn't have the aggressive flavour that made kidneys polarising. Around you, people are eating enthusiastically. This isn't performance food like the swan. This is genuine appetite. These are flavours people grew up with, flavours that signal home cooking. Family slaughters, the practical reality of turning a living animal into winter sustenance. The organs taste like survival, like not wasting, like the kind of eating that happens when you can't afford to be squeamish, because squeamish means hungry. Historians still argue about class distinctions in organ consumption. Did nobles eat kidneys? Yes, but prepared differently in wine sauces with expensive spices presented as delicacies. Did peasants eat liver? Yes, but simply cooked with whatever herbs grew near the house. The organ was the same. The presentation shifted. The underlying practicality remained constant. Organs spoil fast, so you eat them first and you make them taste as good as you can. Your plate is nearly empty. The iron taste lingers in your mouth, coating your tongue, settling into your teeth. Outside animals are still alive, their organs still working, pumping blood and filtering waste and beating steadily, unaware that someday they might end up here on a plate being chewed and swallowed by creatures who convince themselves that eating hearts makes their own hearts stronger. The servants clear the organ course. Someone's already talking about the next dish. The feast rolls onward relentless. The next course doesn't arrive on a platter. Instead, a servant approaches with a ledger, an actual bound book, and begins reading aloud. You realize this isn't about food you're going to eat right now. This is about food as currency. The servant is tallying rents paid in eels. Hundreds of eels. Thousands, maybe. And everyone at the table is nodding like this makes perfect sense because in medieval Europe it did. Eels were money. Not metaphorically, literally. You could pay your rent in eels. You could settle debts in eels. You could bribe officials, tip priests, compensate labourers, all in eels. Some manorial records from medieval England show tenants owing their lords specific quantities of eels, annually 50 eels at Christmas, 100 eels at Michaelmas, 200 eels delivered fresh to the manor kitchen. Miss your eel payment and you'd face the same consequences as missing any other rent fines, eviction, legal trouble. This wasn't a quirky regional oddity. This was widespread, systematic, documented across centuries. Why? Because eels were abundant, catchable, and critically they stayed alive out of water longer than most fish. An eel could survive for hours in a damp sack, meaning you could transport them miles from river to kitchen without them spoiling. They were living currency that didn't require minting, banking, or trust. An eel was an eel. You could see it wriggling. You knew what you were getting. The servant is still reading. Geoffrey of Ashford 60 eels delivered. William the Miller 40 eels short by 10 to be delivered before Advent or face penalty of 6p. The numbers blur together, but the message is clear. This entire estate, this feast you're attending, is partially funded by slimy snake-like fish that people trapped in weirs and delivered by the basketful. Eel weirs were everywhere in medieval Europe. These were elaborate wooden or stone structures built across rivers designed to trap eels during their migrations. Eels are catadromous. They spawn in the ocean but live in fresh water, so twice in their lives they're in transit vulnerable. In spring, juvenile eels called elvers swim upstream by the millions. In autumn, adult eels swim downstream to spawn in the Sargasso Sea. Medieval fishermen knew this pattern intimately and built entire economies around it. A good weir could catch thousands of eels in a single night during migration season. The eels would swim into the funnel-shaped trap following the current and couldn't figure out how to swim back out. By morning, fishermen would have baskets overflowing. Some eels would be sold fresh. Others would be salted, smoked, or pickled for preservation. The rest delivered as rent, as tithes payment. Churches demanded eel tithes. Monasteries owned eel fisheries and jealously guarded the rights. Disputes over eel fishing territories ended up in court, sometimes violently. In some regions, eel fishing rights were more valuable than the land itself. Control the weir, control the wealth. It sounds absurd until you realise that in a primarily non-monetary economy, having access to thousands of units of tradable protein makes you rich in the only way that matters. You can feed people, pay people, and people owe you. But let's talk about eating them, because while eels were currency, they were also food. Eel pie eel, stew jellied eel, roasted eel in wine sauce. Medieval cookbooks are full of eel recipes. The preparation varied, but the basic challenge remained constant. Eels are bony, fatty, and have a slime coating that needs to be scrubbed off before cooking. They're also tough to kill. You can cut an eel's head off, and it'll keep moving for minutes, the body writhing, the muscles contracting in dying spasms that make medieval kitchens look like scenes from a nightmare. Fresh eel tastes mild, slightly sweet, with firm white flesh if cooked properly. The fat content is high. Medieval physicians considered this a virtue, fat being concentrated nutrition. But it also means eel can taste greasy if poorly prepared. The skin is tough and usually removed before eating, though some recipes kept it on grilled until crispy. Remember the lamprey from earlier. Lampreys and eels occupied similar culinary space, both long, both aquatic, both fish for Lenten purposes, but they weren't the same. Lampreys were luxury. Eels were practical. Lampreys killed kings. Eels paid rent. One was exotic. The other was everywhere. The servant finishes reading the eel accounts. Someone makes a joke about Geoffrey of Ashford's short count, and laughter ripples around the table. Eel theft was apparently a real issue. People would poach from weirs at night, stealing currency, literally swimming past their doors. Getting caught meant fines, sometimes public punishment, but the temptation was enormous. Why work all week when you could sneak to the weir after midnight and scoop out 20 eels? 20 eels might equal a month's wages for a labourer. Historians still argue about the scale of the eel economy. How many eels were actually traded annually? How standardised were the units? Did one eel mean any eel, or were there size requirements? Records show disputes over eel quality, suggesting some standardisation existed, but the details are murky. What's clear is that for centuries, European rivers and wetlands were essentially eel factories, and human societies organised themselves around harvesting that resource as efficiently as possible. And then we destroyed it, drained the wetlands, built dams, polluted the rivers. European eel populations have crashed down 95% in some areas, and the currencies of payment by eel now seems quaint historical safely distant. But for medieval people, this was just economic reality. You needed protein, you needed currency. Eels solved both problems. They wriggled through your hands and into your ledgers, your kitchens, your stomachs, your entire conception of what wealth meant. No actual eels arrive at the table tonight. They're not in season, or they've already been allocated, or perhaps this is just a wealthy enough household that they don't need to eat their currency. But the ledger reading was a reminder. Everything you've consumed tonight, every bizarre creature and culinary excess exists because of systems like this. Systems that turned living things into transactions, ecosystems into economies, and made it possible for a table full of nobles to spend hours eating their way through creation, while somewhere a tenant is desperately trying to catch 10 more eels before the deadline. The ledger is closed, the numbers are settled, the meal continues, finally a break from meat. A servant pours something pale and creamy into your cup, not wine, not water, but something thick enough to coat the sides of the vessel. You taste it cautiously. It's sweet nutty with a faint graininess. Almond milk. And over the next few minutes you realise it's not just a drink, it's everywhere. In the soup that arrives next, in the sauce on the fish, in the dessert custard. Almond milk has infiltrated every course, and suddenly you understand this isn't a preference. This is necessity. Welcome to the medieval dairy dilemma. For roughly half the year every Friday, the entire 40 days of Lent, Advent, Ember Days, the vigils of major feasts, the church forbade consuming anything from a lactating animal. No milk, no butter, no cheese, no cream. Which created an enormous problem. Medieval cuisine depended on dairy, cream-thickened sauces, butter-enriched vegetables. Cheese provided protein when meat was scarce. Take dairy away and you've just crippled half your recipes. Enter the almond. Almonds could be ground soaked in water and pressed to produce a liquid that looked like milk, acted like milk in cooking, and critically contained nothing from an animal. It was plant-based, therefore permissible, therefore suddenly the most important ingredient in any kitchen that wanted to maintain culinary standards during fasting periods. The process was labour-intensive. You'd start with blanched almonds, the brown skins removed by scalding, then grind them into paste using a mortar and pestle. Add water, gradually working it into a slurry. Let it steep. Then squeeze the mixture through cloth, wringing out every drop of liquid. What remained in the cloth was almond paste, which could be dried and used for marzipan. What dripped through was almond milk, opaque white, rich enough to mimic dairy. A noble kitchen during Lent would go through pounds of almonds daily. They were expensive, imported from Spain, Italy, North Africa, which meant almond milk was a status marker. If your Lenten soups were creamy and white, you had money. If they were thin and watery, you didn't. The wealthy could maintain their culinary lifestyle through fasting periods. The poor made do with vegetable broths and prayers. Almond milk wasn't just for drinking. It became the base for dozens of fasting versions of regular dishes. Wanted something like custard, almond milk egg yolks. Eggs were debated, but often permitted sugar cooked slowly. Wanted creamy fish stew, almond milk instead of cream. Wanted rich soup, almond milk with bread for thickening. Medieval cookbooks contain parallel recipes, one version with dairy, one with almond milk, so you could pivot depending on the calendar. But here's where it gets interesting. Almond milk didn't quite taste like dairy. It was sweeter, nuttier, less tangy. This meant dishes made with it had a different flavour profile, and over time that flavour became associated with piety. Almond milk tasted like Lent. It tasted like sacrifice, like devotion, like being wealthy enough to afford proper fasting food rather than just going hungry. The soup before you now is thick with almond milk studded with shredded fish, probably pike or cod, and coloured with saffron to give it a golden hue. It's good, genuinely good. The almond milk adds a subtle sweetness that complements the fish, and the texture is creamy enough to feel indulgent. You wouldn't know this was fasting food if someone hadn't told you. Historians still argue about whether medieval people preferred almond milk to dairy, or just tolerated it as a necessary substitute. Some evidence suggests almond milk was genuinely popular even outside fasting periods. Its keeping quality was better than fresh milk, which spoiled within hours. Almond milk could last days if stored properly. For kitchens without refrigeration that longevity mattered, the almond milk industry shaped trade routes. Merchants specialised in importing almonds from Mediterranean regions, where they grew abundantly. Ships carried tons of almonds north to England, France, Germany, anywhere. The climate was too cold for almond trees, but the population was wealthy enough to afford fasting in style. Some monasteries maintained their own almond groves in southern regions, ensuring supply during Lent. There were cheaper substitutes: hazelnut milk, walnut milk. Even bread soaked and squeezed could produce a whitish liquid that approximated milk if you squinted and didn't think too hard. But almonds were premium, sweeter, smoother, more prestigious. Serving almond milk dishes announced that you weren't just observing the fasting rules, you were mastering them, turning restriction into opportunity to display wealth. Around the table, everyone's consuming almond milk in various forms: the soup, the fish sauce, the drink in their cups. It's seamless integration, a parallel dairy system that kicks in whenever the church calendar demands it. You realise that medieval cooking wasn't just one cuisine, it was two cuisines operating on a toggle switch. Meat days versus fast days. Butter versus almond milk. Beef versus fish. The same dishes reimagined through different ingredients, the same appetite channeled through different rules, and the almonds keep coming. The next course, something that looks like blancmange. A white pudding of rice, almond milk and shredded chicken arrives, and you can taste the almonds again, that nutty sweetness threading through everything. Someone mentions that tomorrow is Saturday, a meat day, and there's audible relief. Not because the food is bad, it isn't, but because maintaining this level of culinary creativity within dietary restrictions is exhausting, expensive, and requires an entire shadow supply chain of imported nuts. The wealthy could afford to fast luxuriously. The poor fasted genuinely thin soups, dried peas, stale bread prayer. The divide wasn't just economic, it was theological. If fasting was supposed to humble you, to make you share in Christ's suffering, to remind you of your mortality, then eating creamy almond milk soup flavoured with saffron and studded with imported fish seemed to miss the point. But no one at this table is interested in humility. They're interested in navigating the rules while maintaining comfort, and almond milk makes that possible. You drain your cup. The almond residue clings to the sides, pale and sweet. Somewhere groves of almond trees are flowering, oblivious to their role in medieval religious dietary politics. Their nuts will be harvested, shipped, ground, squeezed and transformed into milk that isn't milk, into piety that tastes like luxury, into fasting that looks suspiciously like feasting. The servants refill your cup. The almond milk keeps flowing. The meal continues. The conversation around the table has shifted to gossip and someone mentions King Henry the Fun. Again, the one from earlier, the one who died after eating lampreys. But now there's more detail, more colour, and you realise this death has achieved legendary status. It's not just a historical footnote. It's a cautionary tale, a dinner party story, a piece of moral instruction wrapped in royal mortality. The year was 1135. Henry was in Normandy, already aging by medieval standards. He was in his 60s, which made him practically ancient. He'd been king for 35 years, surviving wars, rebellions, the death of his son in a shipwreck, all the usual medieval royal catastrophes. What finally got him was a meal. According to the chroniclers, and you have to take their word for it because no one was taking notes during the actual dinner, Henry ate a surfeit of lampreys. That word surfeit is important. It doesn't just mean he ate lampreys. It means he ate too many lampreys, ignored warnings, overindulged to the point of illness. His physician supposedly advised against it. Henry supposedly ignored the advice. Kings don't take orders from physicians, especially not about dinner. Within days he was sick. Fever, digestive distress. The chronicles are vague about specifics but clear about the outcome. He died. And immediately the lampreys became famous. Not because they were toxic, they weren't, but because they'd killed a king, which meant they were dangerous in a way that commanded respect and a certain dark fascination. Here's what probably actually happened according to historians who have analysed the accounts. Henry likely had food poisoning, possibly exacerbated by existing health problems. Lampreys are rich, fatty fish. Eating too many, especially if they were improperly preserved or prepared, could absolutely cause severe digestive issues. Add autumn heat in Normandy, add aging digestive system, add the stress of ruling a kingdom, and you have a recipe for fatal illness that has less to do with lampreys specifically and more to do with everything at once going wrong. But medieval people didn't think in terms of food poisoning and bacteria. They thought in terms of humours, the balance of hot, cold, wet and dry that supposedly governed health. Lampreys were considered hot and moist in humoral theory. Eating too many would create an excess of hot moisture in the body, leading to fever and potentially death. The physician's warning wasn't about bacteria, it was about maintaining humoral balance. Henry's body, already old and possibly out of balance, couldn't handle the lamprey's heat. This made perfect sense to medieval medical theory. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was medicine capable of healing or harming depending on quantity and constitution. Eating lampreys when your body was already too hot was like adding fuel to a fire. Eventually you'd burn out. And so the story became a morality tale, the king who wouldn't listen to his physician. The king who let appetite override wisdom. The king who died because he couldn't control himself. It appeared in chronicles, in sermons, in medical texts warning about the dangers of dietary excess. Lampreys became simultaneously desirable and dangerous a food that carried royal prestige and royal peril. But here's the uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to discuss: people kept eating lampreys anyway. In fact, Henry's death might have made them more desirable. Dangerous food is exciting food. Food that killed a king is food worth bragging about. If you could eat a plate of lampreys and survive, you'd proven something: your constitution was stronger than Henry's, your body more balanced, your understanding of humoral medicine more sophisticated. The story spread beyond England. Beyond. French nobles knew it. German nobles knew it. Lampreys acquired a reputation: eat them carefully in moderation, with proper medical advice. Don't be like Henry. Don't let appetite override sense. But definitely still eat them because they're delicious and expensive and prove you can afford food dangerous enough to have killed royalty. Historians still argue about whether Henry actually died from the lampreys, or whether the lampreys were just convenient scapegoats for death from other causes. Medieval people loved assigning blame to specific foods, rather than acknowledging the randomness of disease and mortality. If Henry died after eating lampreys, the lampreys must have killed him, regardless of what else might have been happening in his body. And the lamprey industry didn't suffer. If anything, demand increased. Cities continued sending lamprey pies to monarchs as gifts and taxes. Fishermen continued trapping them in weirs. Cookbooks continued including lamprey recipes, sometimes with notes about preparation care, clean them thoroughly, don't eat too many, balance them with cooling foods, but never suggesting you shouldn't eat them at all. You look at the table at the remains of courses already consumed. How many of these dishes carried risks? The porpoise could have been diseased. The hedgehog could have eaten something toxic. The organs could have been from a sick animal. Medieval diners faced these risks constantly with no food safety regulations, no refrigeration, no understanding of pathogens. Every meal was a gamble. Most of the time you survived. Occasionally you didn't. And if you were a king, your death became a story that people told at feasts for centuries. Someone at the table is retelling the Henry story now, embellishing details. Maybe the lampreys were as long as a man's arm, maybe Henry ate 20 of them. Maybe the physician wept as he begged the king to stop. The details shift with each telling, but the moral remains constant: appetite can kill you. Even royal appetite. Especially royal appetite, because royalty can afford to eat enough of the dangerous stuff to actually cause harm. The lamprey that killed Henry, if it was even one specific lamprey, if the story is even true in the way chronicles present, it has become immortal. More famous than any of Henry's political achievements, more remembered than his 35-year reign. One fish, one meal, one death, echoing through centuries. You think about the lamprey pie you ate earlier. You're fine. Probably. The lampreys were properly prepared, probably fresh, probably harmless. But there's a tiny thrill in having eaten the same dish that killed a king. You've touched mortality through your appetite. You've survived something Henry didn't. The conversation moves on. Someone mentions next week's hunt. Someone else complains about their tenant's eel shortage. The feast continues as feasts do, because ultimately everyone at this table believes they're different from Henry. Smarter, more moderate, less susceptible to the dangers of overindulgence. They're eating the same foods, taking the same risks. They just don't know it yet. The servants bring out another bird, and for a moment you hope it's something normal, a chicken maybe, or even a duck. But the legs are too long, the neck is too extended, the beak is dagger sharp and nearly as long as your forearm. It's a heron. A wading bird pulled from a marsh, roasted and presented as if this is exactly what everyone should be eating on a Thursday evening in the year of our Lord 1300 and something. Herons weren't uncommon on medieval tables. Neither were storks, cranes, egrets. Basically any large wading bird that spent its time stabbing frogs and fish in shallow water became fair game for the kitchen. They weren't scavengers like crows or ravens, which were generally avoided despite being edible. Wading birds ate clean food fish frogs, water insects, which made them acceptable by medieval logic. They lived near water, which gave them that useful aquatic association that could blur the line between meat and fish depending on how desperate your theological argument needed to be. But let's be honest, herons taste terrible. Even medieval cookbooks, which rarely admitted that anything tasted bad, offered recipes clearly designed to mask the flavour. Long marinades in wine and vinegar, heavy spice rubs, elaborate sauces. The subtext screamed, "This meat needs help." Heron flesh is dark, stringy, strongly flavoured with a fishy, muddy undertone from their diet. It's gamey in the worst sense, not pleasantly wild like venison, but aggressively wrong like something that died a week ago and was preserved through sheer determination. You cut a piece. The meat is tough, requiring genuine sawing with your knife. When you finally get a bite-sized portion free and put it in your mouth, the taste confirms everything. It's fishy, but not in a good way. Muddy. Slightly bitter. The kind of flavour that makes you understand why the cooks buried it under rosemary and garlic. so why eat it? Same reason as everything else to night status. Herons weren't livestock. You couldn't raise them in a coop or pen them in a yard. They were wild, which meant hunting them required skill-trained hawks, or at minimum the effort of trudging through marshlands with nets and poles. They were seasonal, more abundant during nesting season, when they gathered in heronries large colonies in trees near water, and they were large. A single heron could weigh 5 pounds, providing more meat than smaller birds. But mostly they were impressive. A roasted heron on your table announced that you had access to wild game, that you controlled hunting rights over marshlands and rivers, that you could serve meat that most people never encountered. In a world where status was constantly performed and reinforced through visible consumption, a heron was a trophy. Storks got similar treatment, though they were rarer in some regions and common in others. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, storks nested on chimneys and rooftops so familiar they were almost domestic. But that didn't make them common food. They were protected in some areas by folk belief considered lucky or even holy. Killing a stork might bring bad fortune. Eating one definitely marked you as someone who didn't care about peasant superstitions. Cranes were the most prestigious of the wading birds, larger than herons with dramatic plumage and a reputation for being clever and difficult to hunt. Crane meat appeared in royal feasts and was sometimes reserved for nobility by sumptuary laws that dictated who could eat what based on social rank. A merchant trying to serve crane at a dinner party might face legal consequences, accused of putting on airs above his station. The heron on your plate isn't getting better with more chewing. If anything, it's worse, the flavour intensifying, coating your tongue with marsh water essence. You reach for wine, swishing it around to cut the taste. Around the table, others are eating, with practised efficiency, cutting the meat, swallowing, quickly moving on. No one's savouring this. No one's pretending it's delicious. It's just something you do when it's served. Historians still argue about how often these wading birds actually appeared on tables versus how often they appeared in documents describing impressive feasts. The written record overrepresents exceptional meals, the kind people bothered writing about. We know cranes were served at royal banquets because chroniclers mentioned them. But did lesser nobles eat heron weekly, or was it a once-a-year novelty? Probably the latter. The effort required to procure and prepare them wasn't worth it. For routine meals when chicken and pork were available, but tonight isn't routine. This is a performance. Remember, every course is a statement, and the heron statement is, we have access to the wild. We can pull resources from marshes and forests and rivers that others can't reach. We don't just eat what we raise, we eat what we conquer. The presentation matters too. The heron has been roasted with its legs left on extended artificially to make it look even larger. Some kitchens would gild the legs actual gold leaf applied to webbed feet that no one would eat but everyone would notice. The waste is part of the point. We can afford to gild inedible parts. We can afford to spend hours preparing something that tastes mediocre because the taste isn't what matters. You finally finish your portion. The aftertaste lingers muddy and persistent. Someone's already making jokes about the bishop's last feast, where the heron was apparently even tougher, practically inedible, and the cook was demoted to scrubbing pots. Laughter around the table, relief that this heron is merely unpleasant rather than catastrophic, and yet they'll serve it again. Next season, next feast, next opportunity to demonstrate control over wild resources. The heron's terribleness is almost beside the point. It's a trophy served on a plate to challenge accepted and consumed proof that appetite can override common sense when status is on the line. The birds are cleared away. Your jaw aches from chewing. Somewhere in a marsh, real herons are standing motionless in shallow water, waiting for fish, unaware that their species has been conscripted into human social theatre, that their bodies are currency in games they don't understand and wouldn't care about if they did. The next course is approaching. You're almost afraid to ask what it is. You've eaten your way through half the animal kingdom at this point, but no one has explained why these specific combinations, these particular preparations. Then a man in dark robes, clearly a physician based on the deference he receives, stands and begins explaining tonight's menu in terms you haven't heard yet. He talks about balances, about humours, about how the lamprey's hot moistness was countered by the cooling dryness of the bread trencher, how the swan's cold qualities required warming spices. Suddenly you realise this entire meal wasn't just about status or theology. It was medicine. Welcome to medieval nutritional theory, where food isn't fuel, it's pharmacy. Every ingredient, every dish, every combination was chosen based on humoral medicine, the dominant medical framework that had governed European healthcare for over 1,000 years. It came from Greek physician Galen, filtered through Islamic scholars, translated into Latin, and eventually accepted as gospel by medieval physicians, cooks, and anyone who wanted to avoid dying from what they ate. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. Everything in the universe, including human bodies and food, contained 4 qualities in varying proportions: hot, cold, wet, dry. These qualities needed to be balanced. Too much heat and you'd develop fever. Too much cold and you'd become lethargic. Too much moisture and you'd have phlegm problems. Too much dryness and you'd waste away. Food was categorized by these qualities. Pork was hot and moist. Fish was cold and wet. Wine was hot and dry. Fruits were generally cold and moist. The trick was combining foods to maintain balance or to correct imbalances, feeling feverish. Eat cooling foods like lettuce and fish, feeling sluggish and cold. Eat warming foods like pepper, ginger, and roasted meats. This wasn't superstition to them, it was science. It was observable, testable within their framework. Eat too much hot food and you sweat, clearly you've overheated your body. Drink too much cold water and you feel chilled, obviously you've cooled yourself excessively. The logic was consistent even if the underlying biology was completely wrong. Medieval cooks were essentially pharmacists. They didn't just make food taste good, they made it medicinally appropriate. A cookbook from this period reads like a medical text offering not just recipes, but instructions on which dishes suit which constitutions. Feeling melancholic? You have an excess of black bile, eat hot dry foods to counter it. Feeling sanguine and energetic? Your blood dominant? Cool yourself with fish and salads. This explains so much about what you've eaten tonight. The spices weren't just expensive status symbols, they were medicine. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon and cloves were all considered hot and dry, perfect for warming cold, wet fish, and countering the potential dangers of eating too much aquatic protein. That's why the lamprey was drowning in spices. Not to mask spoilage, though, it helped with that too, but to balance its humoral qualities. The physician is still talking, gesturing at the remnants of courses. He explains that the porpoise required wine sauce, because wine's heat balanced the cold, wet nature of sea creatures. The organs were served mid-meal because liver and heart being hot and dry helped digestive fires burn stronger, preparing the stomach for later courses. Even the almond milk made sense. Almonds were hot in the 2nd degree and moderately moist, making them warming but not excessively so, perfect for fast days when you needed sustenance without overheating your digestion. Historians still argue about how seriously people took humoral theory in daily practice, versus how much it was just theoretical framework that physicians loved, but cooks ignored. The evidence suggests both wealthy households definitely consulted physicians about meal planning, especially for sick or elderly family members. But peasants cooking pottage probably weren't calculating humoral balances, they were just using what they had. Still, the theory shaped cuisine at every level. It explained why certain combinations became traditional, why fish was served with lemon or vinegar, the acid's heat balanced fish's coldness, why roasted meats came with wine, both hot, creating an intensely warming combination suitable for cold weather, Why fruits were often cooked or served with wine rather than eaten raw fruit was dangerously cold and wet. Cooking it dried and warmed it to safer levels. It also explained seasonal eating in ways that made intuitive sense. Winter required warming foods, roasted meats, hot wine spices. Summer required cooling foods, salads, cold water, diluted wine, fresh fruits. This wasn't just practical advice about what grew when it was medical necessity. Eating cold foods in winter could literally kill you by chilling your body too much, allowing disease to take hold. The physician sits down, satisfied with his explanation. You look at your plate differently now. That piece of bread isn't just bread, it's dry and moderately warm, designed to absorb excess moisture from wet dishes. That wine isn't just alcohol, it's hot and dry medicine, prescribed to balance the meal's overall humoral profile. Even the order of courses follows medical logic: start light and cold, build to heavy and hot end with warming spices and wine to seal the stomach and prevent vapours from rising to the brain. Medieval medicine was wrong about nearly everything. Humours don't exist. Food doesn't have elemental qualities. You can't cure disease by eating opposite temperature ingredients. But within this framework, medieval people created a sophisticated cuisine that actually worked on some levels. High-fat foods do help you stay warm in winter. Acidic foods do aid digestion of heavy proteins. Spices do have antibacterial properties that helped preserve meat. They had the right practices for the wrong reasons, and the psychology mattered. If you believed that eating warming foods would protect you from winter illness, you probably took better care of yourself, ate heartier meals, stayed near fires, avoided getting chilled. The placebo effect of good humoral medicine might have been genuinely protective, even if the mechanism was imaginary. Around the table, conversation has moved on, but you're still thinking about it. Every weird creature you've eaten tonight: dormouse, lamprey, puffin, beaver tail, porpoise, swan, hedgehog. Whale organs, heron was chosen partly for status, partly for theology, but also for its humoral properties. The meal was a carefully orchestrated medical treatment disguised as a feast. You weren't just fed, you were balanced. The physician catches your eye and nods as if he knows you've finally understood. Food is medicine. Medicine is food. The boundary doesn't exist. Every bite is a prescription. Every meal a treatment. Every feast a therapeutic intervention designed to keep bodies in equilibrium with themselves and the seasons and the cosmos. The next course arrives. You wonder what it's treating. The next course isn't solid food. It's a drink poured steaming into ornate cups and passed around with ceremonial care. The smell hits you before you taste it. Cinnamon cloves, something sweeter, something almost medicinal. You take a sip. It's wine, but wine transformed, spiced, sweetened, heated, until it's become something entirely different. Someone murmurs Hippocrates with genuine appreciation, and suddenly everyone at the table is cradling their cups, inhaling the vapours, sipping slowly like this is the moment they've been waiting for all night. Hippocrates, named supposedly after Hippocrates, though the ancient Greek physician would have been baffled by this concoction, was medieval Europe's answer to the question, how do you make wine fancy? The answer involved enough spices to bankrupt a minor merchant. Cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, ginger root. Grains of paradise if you were really showing off an exotic African spice that cost more than gold by weight. All of this would be steeped in good wine, then sweetened with honey or sugar, filtered through a cloth bag called a Hippocrates sleeve and served either cold in summer or heated in winter. What you're drinking represents a small fortune. The cinnamon alone cost more than most people earned in a month. It came from Ceylon, transported across the Indian Ocean, through Arab trading networks across the Mediterranean, through Venice or Genoa, and finally overland to wherever you're sitting. Each stick passed through dozens of hands, each taking their cut. By the time it reached your cup, that cinnamon had travelled further than most medieval people travelled in their entire lives. The wine underneath the spices is good too, probably from Bordeaux or Burgundy regions already famous for quality viticulture. You wouldn't waste expensive spices on cheap wine. That would be like putting gold leaf on a wooden coin. Hippocras required good wine as its foundation then elevated it into something that tasted like liquid luxury, like drinking distilled wealth. But Hippocras wasn't just about taste or status, it was like everything else tonight medical. Those spices weren't decorative, they were therapeutic. Cinnamon was hot in the 3rd degree perfect for warming the stomach and aiding digestion. Cloves were hot and dry, prescribed for weakness and stomach complaints. Ginger heated the blood and promoted circulation. Together they created a digestive tonic that was supposed to settle your stomach after a heavy meal, prevent food from sitting too long in the gut, and generally keep your humours balanced while you stuffed yourself with swan and hedgehog. The timing of the Hippocras was deliberate. Some households served it mid-meal as a digestive break, others saved it for the end. Either way, it marked a transition from eating to drinking, from meal to conversation, from performance to relaxation. Once the Hippocras appeared, you could slow down. The serious eating was finished. Now came the drinking, the talking, the lingering at the table, while servants cleared plates and musicians played. Medieval physicians prescribed Hippocras for specific ailments. Weak stomach, drink Hippocras before meals to stimulate appetite and strengthen digestion. Feeling cold, Hippocras would warm you from inside. Recovering from illness, the spiced wine would restore your strength, they claimed, by rebalancing your humours and encouraging healthy blood production. Some recipes added ingredients beyond spices, rose water for cooling, musk for warming. Even gold leaf for those who believed ingesting precious metals conveyed their properties to the consumer. The drink had social rituals attached. You didn't gulp Hippocras, you sipped it, appreciating the complexity, the balance of sweet and spice, the warmth spreading through your chest. Conversations became slower, more thoughtful. The Hippocras effect wasn't just alcohol, though there was plenty of that. It was the cumulative warmth of wine and spices creating a gentle euphoria, a satisfied haze that made the world seem slightly softer, more forgiving. Historians still argue about whether Hippocras recipes were standardized or wildly variable. The evidence suggests both professional apothecaries sold pre-mixed spice blends for Hippocras, suggesting some standardization. But household recipes varied wildly, some heavy on cinnamon, others favouring ginger, some so sweet they were basically spiced honey with wine added. The flexibility was part of the appeal. You could adjust the recipe to suit your taste, your budget, your medical needs. The cost limited Hippocras to the wealthy, but its reputation spread wider. Peasants knew about Hippocras the way they knew about silk and jewels, as something nobles consumed, aspirational luxuries that defined the upper classes. Some households served a cheaper version called peasant, using less expensive spices and lower quality wine, but it wasn't the same. Real Hippocras required real money. You're on your second cup now. The warmth has settled into your bones, mixing with the wine from earlier courses, with the fat from the organ meats, with the sheer, exhausting fullness of having eaten for hours. The Hippocras makes it all feel intentional, balanced, therapeutic rather than gluttonous. You're not overeating, you're medicinally nourishing yourself. The spices ensure proper digestion. The wine warms your blood. The sugar provides energy. This is health medieval style. Around the table, faces are flushed with wine and warmth. Conversations overlap, laughter comes easier. Someone's telling a story about a bishop who drank so much Hippocras he fell asleep at his own feast and had to be carried to bed by servants. More laughter. The Hippocras keeps flowing, servants circulating with pitchers, refilling cups that never quite empty. And here's the uncomfortable truth: the spices in your cup cost more than a labourer's annual income. These sugar, if there's sugar rather than honey, and in wealthy households there usually was, came from distant plantations worked by slaves. The wine required vineyards, pressing equipment, storage barrels, transportation networks. Your single cup of hippocras represents the labour of hundreds of people across thousands of miles, all so you can sip spiced wine and feel sophisticated about it. But you're not thinking about that. You're thinking about how good it tastes, how the cinnamon lingers on your tongue, how the warmth pools in your stomach. You're thinking that you understand why people serve this, why they spent ridiculous money on spices, why hippocras appeared in poems and romances as the drink of refined civilization. Because it is refined. Because it does taste extraordinary. Because for these moments, sipping spiced wine by candlelight while musicians play and servants hover, you feel like you're experiencing something transcendent, something that elevates mere eating into an art form. The cup empties. You consider asking for more. The night is settling in, and the hippocras makes it feel less like ending and more like gentle transformation into something quieter, warmer, more contemplative. The meal isn't quite over, but the hippocras signals you're entering the final movements. Just when you think the meal is winding down, when the hippocras has made you drowsy and satisfied, the servants bring out something that looks like porridge. Thick greyish-white, studded with what might be grains or might be shredded meat. Honestly, at this point, your eyes are struggling to focus. Someone says frumenti, with the same reverence they gave the hippocras, and you realise this isn't just any porridge. This is ceremonial porridge. This is porridge that appears at weddings, wakes, and apparently fancy feasts when the host wants to prove they understand tradition. Frumenti, also called fermenti frumenti, or a dozen other spellings, because medieval people were creatively inconsistent with language, was wheat porridge boiled in milk or almond milk until it reached a thick, creamy consistency. But that's like calling a wedding cake sweetened bread. Technically accurate, spiritually insufficient. The frumenti before you isn't plain. It's been enriched with egg yolks sweetened with honey, or sugar spiced with saffron that turns it a pale golden colour. There are bits of meat mixed in, probably venison or pork shredded fine. Some recipes added dried fruits, nuts, more spices. The result was something between porridge and pudding, between savoury and sweet, existing in that peculiar medieval culinary space where modern categories don't quite apply. You taste it. The texture is dense, creamy, from the almond milk, because of course it's almond milk. It's still a fast day in the church calendar. The wheat has been cracked and boiled until soft but still slightly chewy, giving the dish substance. The sweetness comes through first, then the saffron's earthy notes, then the meat unexpected but not unpleasant, just there reminding you that medieval people didn't separate sweet and savoury the way modern palates do. Frumenti had serious cultural significance. It appeared at major life events, weddings, especially served to bride and groom, as a symbol of fertility and prosperity. The wheat represented abundance. The milk represented nourishment. The combination promised children health, successful union. Refusing frumenti at your own wedding was practically unthinkable, like refusing to cut the cake in later centuries. But it also appeared at funerals, at Christmas feasts, at harvest celebrations. It was versatile ceremonial food adaptable to different contexts. At celebrations it would be rich, thick, with cream, heavy with meat, golden with saffron. At funerals it would be simpler, plain wheat, in water, minimal sweetening, a comfort food that acknowledged grief, while still providing sustenance. The preparation required effort. Wheat had to be cracked or pounded to break the grains whole. Wheat would take too long to cook and wouldn't achieve the right creamy texture. Then it would simmer for hours, stirring regularly to prevent scorching, adding liquid as needed. The result was labour-intensive, which made it appropriate for special occasions. You didn't make frumenti for Tuesday dinner. You made it when it meant something. Historians still argue about frumenti's origins. Some trace it to ancient Roman wheat porridges, others to Anglo-Saxon grain dishes. Probably it evolved from multiple sources, different cultures, all discovering that boiling grain in liquid until it becomes soft and nourishing is a fairly universal human impulse. What made medieval frumenti distinct was its ceremonial status, its association with specific rituals and celebrations. Different regions had different frumenti traditions. In England, it was closely linked to Christmas, appearing alongside roast meats and mince pies. In France, versions called fromenté used similar ingredients but different spicing. Across Europe, the basic concept remained ceremonial wheat porridge that marked important moments. The frumenti you're eating is high status. You can tell by the saffron, by the quality of the meat mixed in. Poor households would eat simpler versions, maybe sweetened with a little honey, if they were lucky, but mostly just wheat and water. The nutritional value was the same grain providing calories and some protein, but the experience was drastically different. Your version tastes like celebration. Theirs tasted like survival, dressed up as tradition. Around the table, people are eating their frumenti with focused attention. This isn't background food like some earlier courses. This is the dish you're supposed to notice, to appreciate, to understand, carries meaning beyond nutrition. Someone mentions their daughter's wedding next month, wondering aloud if the frumenti will be as good as this. Others offer advice about preparation, about the best wheat sauces, about whether to use saffron or save money with turmeric. The conversation reveals how deeply frumenti is embedded in social life. It's not just food, it's a marker of competence. A good household makes good frumenti. A memorable feast includes memorable frumenti. The quality of your frumenti reflects on your status, your resources, your understanding of tradition. Medieval people understood that food created community. Eating the same dishes at weddings and funerals, at harvest and holy days, created shared experiences across generations. Your grandmother ate frumenti at her wedding. You ate it at yours. Your grandchildren will eat it at theirs. The recipe might vary, the ingredients might change slightly, but the fundamental act, eating ceremonial wheat porridge at important moments, connects you to past and future, to everyone who ever marks significant life events by preparing and consuming the specific dish. You finish your bowl. The frumenti sits heavy in your stomach, adding to the accumulated weight of the entire meal. You're beyond full, now entering that state where eating becomes mechanical, where your body is protesting, but social obligation demands you continue. The servants are clearing frumenti bowls. Someone's already talking about the final course. There's apparently still more coming, though you can't imagine how. The hypocras warmth, the frumenti starch. The hours of continuous eating have left you in a dazed state where everything feels slightly unreal, like you're watching yourself participate in this feast, rather than actually being here. But the tradition demands you continue. The ceremony isn't complete until every course is served, consumed, acknowledged. Frumenti marked a transition from the main feast to the ending, from secular indulgence to something more thoughtful, more connected to larger patterns of life and death and celebration. The final course is approaching. Surely this is the end. Surely there can't be more. You are wrong. There's more. But this time it's not food in any recognizable sense. It's architecture. The servants carry out what looks like a miniature castle, complete with towers, walls, battlements, all rendered in a pale yellowish-white material that gleams in the candlelight. It takes you a moment to realize it's edible. The entire structure is made from sugar paste and marzipan hours of labor, transformed into something that sits at the weird intersection between sculpture and dessert. Welcome to the subtlety medieval fine dining's grand finale, the course designed not to nourish, but to astonish. The name is magnificently ironic because there's nothing subtle about a 2-foot-tall castle made of sugar sitting on your table. These creations were called subtleties because they represented subtle or skillful craftsmanship, the kind of intricate work that required genuine artistry. They were edible sculptures, propaganda pieces disguised as dessert, the final statement in a meal full of statements. The castle before you isn't just decorative, it's narrative. The battlements are painted with heraldic symbols you recognise as belonging to your host family. The towers have tiny flags made of rice paper. The walls are decorated with scenes that, if you squint, depict some military victory or important alliance. This isn't just sugar, it's a political message crafted from sweetness, designed to remind everyone at this table exactly whose power they're celebrating by eating here. Marzipan was the foundation for most subtleties. Ground almonds mixed with sugar kneaded until pliable, then shaped like clay into whatever form the cook's imagination or the host's orders demanded. It could be moulded, carved, painted with food dyes gilded with actual gold leaf. The result was stable enough to hold complex shapes, but sweet enough to justify calling it food rather than purely decorative sculpture. The labour involved was staggering. This castle probably took a team of cooks and their assistants several days to construct. First they'd make the marzipan in huge batches, pounding almonds, mixing sugar kneading until the consistency was right. Then they'd build the structure piece by piece using sugar syrup as mortar, carefully balancing walls and towers, painting details with brushes dipped in food colouring, made from saffron spinach juice berry stains. The final step would be assembly at the table, usually coordinated with the servant's entrance for maximum dramatic impact. And here's the absurd part: after all that work, people were expected to eat it. The subtlety would sit at the table for a while, long enough for everyone to admire it, comment on the craftsmanship, appreciate the symbolism. Then someone, usually a person of high rank, would break off a piece. This acted as permission for others to dismantle the creation consuming it, piece by piece, until the castle or ship or saint or whatever it was became just sticky fingers and sugar-coated plates. Subtleties came in endless varieties. Saints for religious feasts, entire scenes from the Bible rendered in marzipan Jesus, and the apostles sitting at a Last Supper table made of sugar. Ships for naval victories complete with rigging made of spun sugar, and tiny sailors sculpted from paste. Animals, both real and mythical lions, dragons, unicorns, all holding heraldic shields or banners. Gardens with trees made from sugar flowers from coloured marzipan, even fountains that actually flow with rosewater or wine through cleverly hidden pipes. The most ambitious subtleties included mechanical elements, subtleties that opened to reveal smaller subtleties inside, birds that appeared to sing through hidden whistles, castles that released live birds when a tower was removed. The line between cookery and engineering blurred until you weren't sure whether the person who made this studied under a master chef or a clockmaker. Historians still argue about whether subtleties were meant to be eaten or just displayed. The evidence suggests both happened, some were consumed, others were purely decorative and possibly not even made from edible materials despite appearing so. The ambiguity was part of the point. Is this food or art? Can you tell the difference? Should there be a difference? The subtlety also served as conversation piece entertainment during the awkward transition from eating to leaving. While people picked at the sugar castle, discussions would range across the symbolism. What the particular scene depicted meant what message the host was sending, whether the craftsmanship was better or worse than the subtlety at last month's feast. It gave the meal a conclusion that was social rather than nutritional, extending the gathering beyond the point where anyone was actually hungry. Someone near you breaks off a battlement and tastes it. Too sweet, they pronounce as if this is sophisticated critique. Others nod and take their own pieces anyway. The marzipan is indeed almost aggressively sweet sugar and almonds in such concentration that eating more than a bite makes your teeth ache. But that's not the point. You're not eating for pleasure anymore. You're eating because the food is there, because the host spent money and labour on this creation, because refusing to participate would be a social slight. You take a small piece of wall. The marzipan is smooth, professionally made, painted with some red dye that tastes faintly of berries. It's fine. Not delicious, not terrible, just sweet and almond flavoured in the way marzipan always is. You swallow and decide that's enough. Your stomach is protesting, your jaw is tired from hours of chewing, your mind is fogged with wine and exhaustion. The castle is systematically dismantled. Towers are removed, walls broken down the courtyard, excavated for sugar foundations. Within minutes, the structure that took days to create is reduced to scattered pieces and crumbs. Some people pocket bits of marzipan, saving them for later, or planning to give them to children. Sugar was still expensive enough that wasting it would be unconscionable, even in this context of extraordinary waste. And that's the final statement even here at a table where dormouse and lamprey and swan and whale have been consumed, where enough protein to feed a village for a week has been eaten by a dozen people. In one evening, the sugar still matters enough to save. Some luxuries are common enough to waste. Sugar isn't quite there yet. The servants are clearing, the subtlety remains. The meal is actually finally ending. People are rising from the table stretching, making their way toward other rooms or toward home, depending on their status and proximity. You stand to feeling the weight of everything you've eaten settle into your body, knowing you'll remember this night not for any single dish, but for the cumulative strangeness, the relentless parade of things you never imagined eating, the performance of it all. The castle is gone, the feast is over, the stories are just beginning. You've moved away from the table now into a side chamber where the air is slightly cooler, and you can finally breathe without the weight of roasted meat pressing down on your lungs. But the meal isn't quite finished, not in the way medieval meals end. There's one more element, one final piece that ties everything together. A servant brings around small cups of something that smells intensely sour, almost vinegary. You take a sip and your entire mouth puckers. It's verjuice, and it's exactly as aggressive as it smells. Verjuice, literally green juice, was the unripe grape juice that medieval cooks used the way modern kitchens use lemon juice. Sour, acidic, sharp enough to cut through fat and wake up a palate dulled by hours of eating. It was made from grapes harvested before they ripened, pressed and bottled, when they were still green and mouth-puckeringly tart. The acidity was fierce, more intense than vinegar, less complex than wine, just pure citric punch. Medieval cuisine loved sourness in a way that modern food mostly doesn't. We've been trained to expect sweet or savoury, maybe umami or salt, occasionally bitter, but aggressive sourness. That's mostly disappeared from fine dining. Medieval food embraced it. Sauces were sour. Dressings were sour. Even some meat preparations involved so much vinegar or verjuice that the dominant flavour was acidic rather than meaty. Part of this was practical. Sourness helped preserve food vinegar, and verjuice both had antimicrobial properties that extended shelf life. But it was also taste preference. Medieval people genuinely liked sour flavours, sought them out, considered them sophisticated. A dish that made your mouth pucker was well seasoned. A dish that tasted balanced by modern standards was probably considered bland. Verjuice showed up everywhere, mixed into sauces for roasted meats, drizzled over fish, used as a base for salad dressings, though salad in medieval terms meant raw vegetables which were viewed with some suspicion considered cold and wet and potentially dangerous unless properly acidified. Verjuice was the correction mechanism, the way you made dangerous raw plants safe, by drenching them in extreme sourness. The cup in your hand is offered as a digestive, the final medicinal dose after hours of eating. The theory humoral medicine again was that the verjuice's cold, dry properties would cut through all the hot, moist foods you'd consumed. The acidity would help your stomach break down the accumulated fats and proteins. Modern medicine would probably agree actually acidic drinks do stimulate digestion, even if not for the reasons medieval physicians thought. You take another sip. It's aggressively unpleasant, but in a clarifying way. Your tongue, which has been coated with fat and sugar and spices, suddenly feels clean. The sourness scours everything away, leaving your mouth raw and alert. It's the opposite of the hypocras, where that was warming and softening. This is sharp and focusing. It snaps you back to awareness after the drowsy haze of wine and fullness. Around the room, others are drinking their verjuice with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some gulp it, quickly getting it over with. Others sip slowly, seemingly enjoying the intensity. A few add it to their remaining wine, creating a medieval version of a wine spritzer that's probably even more unpleasant than either component alone. But verjuice wasn't the only extreme acid in medieval kitchens. Vinegar appeared constantly, not the mild balsamic or rice vinegars of modern cooking, but harsh wine vinegar or ale vinegar that could strip enamel from your teeth if used undiluted. Medieval recipes casually called for quantities of vinegar that would seem insane today. Add vinegar until the sauce is properly sharp might mean adding enough to make the dish more acid than food. This sourness obsession extended to other ingredients. Bitter oranges. Seville oranges, the kind that are basically inedible raw, were prized for their intensely sour juice. Sorrel, a leaf so tart it makes your jaw clench, was a common pot herb. Even fruits were sometimes picked unripe, specifically because the sourness was desirable, not a flaw to be avoided. Historians still argue about why medieval European cuisine went so aggressively sour. Some theories point to preservation needs. Acidic foods lasted longer in age without refrigeration. Others suggest it was a holdover from Roman cooking, which also loved extreme flavours, including heavy use of fermented fish sauce and vinegar. Still others propose that medieval palates were simply different, trained by their food environment to appreciate intensities that modern tongues find overwhelming. The class divide appeared here too. Wealthy tables had access to imported citrus, to carefully made verjuice from good grapes, to aged vinegars that were harsh but complex. Poor tables had whatever fermented ale vinegar made from failed beer, wild crabapple verjuice that was so sour it barely qualified as food. Both were acidic, but the experience was different. Wealth brought you sourness with nuance. Poverty gave you sourness with nothing else. You've finished your verjuice. Your mouth feels scraped clean, almost painfully so. The sourness lingers, making even your own saliva taste acidic. But there's also clarity. The fog of wine has lifted slightly. The fullness in your stomach feels more manageable. The overwhelming sensory input of the meal has been cut through by this final sharp note. And that's exactly what it was designed to do. The verjuice is the punctuation mark at the end of the feast, the period that signals this is finished. No more food is coming. Your palate has been reset. You can go home now, though you'll be tasting this meal, all of it, from the dormouse to the sugar castle, for days to come. Medieval meals understood something about endings that modern dining sometimes forgets. You need a definitive conclusion, not a gentle fade out, not a drift from table to departure, but a clear signal that transforms eating time into post-eating time. The verjuice is that signal, sharp, unpleasant, memorable, and ultimately effective. People are leaving now, making their farewells, thanking the host, commenting on specific dishes they'll remember. You join the exodus, moving toward doors and cold night air, carrying in your stomach the weight of an entire ecosystem's worth of creatures, all transformed into this singular experience of medieval excess. The verjuice aftertaste follows you out the door. You step outside into the cold night air, and the contrast is so sharp it almost hurts. Inside was heat, smoke, the press of bodies, and endless food. Out here is silence, darkness, the kind of crystalline cold that makes your breath visible even in the dim light from the doorway behind you. Your stomach is impossibly full, gurgling and protesting, trying to process the sheer volume and variety of what you've just consumed. And as you stand there letting the cold air clear your head, you start to understand what you've actually witnessed. This wasn't just a meal. It was a demonstration of power so complete that it required consuming entire ecosystems to make the point. Think about what crossed that table tonight: creatures from rivers, from oceans, from forests, from marshes, from the sky itself. Dormice that spent their lives in tree hollows, lampreys that migrated between fresh water and salt, puffins that nested on cliffs and dove for fish, beavers that built dams, porpoises that swam in pods, swans that mated for scythe, hedgehogs that curled into defensive balls, whales that sang songs across hundreds of miles, herons that stood motionless in shallow water waiting for prey. All of them ended up on plates reduced to their utility as food, as status symbols, as theological loopholes, as humoral medicine. Their lives, their behaviours, their ecological roles, none of that mattered once they entered the sphere of human appetite. They became ingredients in a performance about wealth and piety and medical sophistication and social hierarchy. And the strange part, it worked. You'll remember this feast for the rest of your life. You'll tell stories about it: the swan that arrived fully feathered, the lamprey that killed a king, the marzipan castle that took days to build and minutes to destroy. You'll remember the tastes, the textures, the sheer overwhelming abundance of it all. Which means the hosts succeeded. They created a memory, established their status, demonstrated their power over resources, networks, and the natural world itself. But there's a cost that no one at that table acknowledged. The ecological impact of eating like this, scaled across hundreds of noble households across decades and centuries, was catastrophic for some species. Swans and cranes became rare, their populations crashed by hunting pressure. Beaver populations collapsed across much of Europe, driven to near extinction for their pelts and their tails. Whale and porpoise populations declined in coastal areas where they were regularly harvested. The medieval feast was effectively strip mining nature for status symbols. The people inside that hall didn't see it that way, of course. They saw abundance, divine provision, the natural order of things with humans at the top. They genuinely believed that God had created animals for human use, that dominion over nature was not just their right, but their duty. Taking a beaver from a stream or a puffin from a cliff wasn't destruction, it was fulfillment of the biblical mandate. Nature existed to serve them. And here's the uncomfortable part: you participated. You ate the dormouse, the lamprey, the porpoise. You didn't protest, didn't refuse, didn't even really question it beyond your initial surprise. You let medieval logic override modern ethics because you were hungry, curious, and socially obligated. Which suggests that our horror at medieval eating practices is more about cultural distance than actual moral superiority. Put us in that context with those assumptions and we do the same things. Your stomach gurgles again, trying to process meat and organs and fish and sugar and spices that span half the known world. The almond milk from Spain, the saffron from somewhere even more distant, the pepper from India, the cinnamon from Ceylon. That single meal connected you to trade routes stretching across continents, to labour you'll never see, to ecosystems you'll never visit. The feast was global in scope, even if the diners never left their immediate region. And tomorrow most of them will wake up and do it again. Not the same scale tonight was special, a performance feast, but the same basic pattern. Meat from animals they didn't raise, fish from waters they don't know, spices from places they can't locate on a map. All of it flowing toward tables where the primary concern is maintaining status and demonstrating that you understand the complicated rules governing what can be eaten when and by whom. The really strange realization is how little has changed. We still eat globally sourced food without thinking about the supply chains. We still use meals to demonstrate status, just with different markers. We still categorize foods into acceptable and unacceptable based on cultural rules that would seem arbitrary to outsiders. We've just swapped dormice for foie gras lamprey, for bluefin tuna swan for wagyu beef. The animals change. The performance continues. You can still taste the verjuice, that final sour note cutting through everything else. It sits on your tongue like a question. What would future people think about what you normally eat? What practices that seem normal now will seem barbaric later? What creatures are we consuming thoughtlessly that our descendants will be horrified by? The cold is seeping through your clothes, now making you shiver. The warmth from inside is fading, replaced by the sharp clarity that comes from stepping outside a heated room into winter air. Your breath clouds in front of you, visible proof of the metabolic fires burning in your chest, trying to process the extraordinary burden you've just given them. Inside, the feast is truly ending now. Servants are clearing tables, banking fires, preparing the hall for tomorrow. The food that wasn't eaten, and there's always food that wasn't eaten, will be distributed according to complex hierarchies. Some will go to servants, some to the poor waiting at the gates. Some will be saved for tomorrow. Nothing is completely wasted, not because of ecological consciousness, but because waste is expensive and the poor are always hungry. You start walking, letting your body move through the cold, helping digestion through activity. The feast becomes memory, even as your stomach protests its reality. Somewhere dormice are sleeping in their nests, unaware that their species is considered a delicacy. Lampreys are migrating upstream, following ancient patterns. Puffins are bobbing on cold ocean swells. They're living their lives, and some of them will end up on tables like the one you just left, transformed from wild creatures into cultural artifacts, into ingredients in someone else's performance of wealth and power. The weirdest thing you ate tonight. Maybe it wasn't any specific animal. Maybe it was the whole system, the theology and medicine and economics and ecology and hierarchy, all mixed together, seasoned with spices worth more than gold, served on a platter of assumptions about humanity's place in the world. You consumed medieval worldview along with medieval cuisine, and both of them are sitting heavy in your stomach as you walk through the cold night, carrying stories you'll tell, but an experience you'll never quite be able to explain. The stars are visible overhead, cold and distant and indifferent. They were there when dormice were just dormice, before anyone thought to cover them in honey. They'll be there long after tonight's feast is forgotten, after the last story is told, after the bones are buried and the recipes are lost. But tonight they watched you eat your way through a catalogue of strangeness, and if stars could judge, you're not sure what verdict they'd deliver. So, let's slow down now. Take a breath, a long, deep one. Feel your own chest rise and fall, so much simpler than the bellows breathing of whales, or the tiny flutter of dormouse lungs. Tonight, you travelled through time without leaving your chair. You tasted extinction and excess theology, an appetite, strangeness that was once normal, and normal that now seems strange. Medieval people weren't so different from us. They were just hungry in different ways, constrained by different rules, seduced by different symbols of success. The feast is over. The stories remain. And somewhere in the distance, between their table and yours, between their world and ours, the dormice are still sleeping. The lampreys still swimming, the old appetite still whispering that if something exists, someone will eventually try to eat it. Let that thought drift away now. Let the images fade, the gilded swan, the lamprey's rows of teeth, the sugar castle crumbling under eager hands. Let it all settle into the comfortable distance of history of stories, told in the dark to help us understand the strange, hungry, endlessly creative creatures we've always been. Rest now. Tomorrow you'll wake in a world where dormice are protected, where lampreys are studied, rather than consumed, where puffins are photographed instead of roasted. You'll drink your coffee or tea from sources you don't think about eating breakfast. You didn't hunt or gather, continuing the ancient human tradition of transforming the world into sustenance, without quite thinking about what that means. But tonight you know, tonight you remember, and that's enough. Good night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.